Hello, I am Bryan Fleishman and I am a student in SPED 461. This course has highlighted many of the inequities that can be observed in education today. There are tremendous issues related to assessment and diagnosis, as well as the over-identification and under-identification of students from different racial backgrounds. Needless to say, there is a lot of work to be done in order to ensure that all students have the ability to succeed in the classroom and beyond. Because there are so many things to fix in education, I would like to focus on one issue that I would argue is a panacea for a plethora of issues. Inclusive education is an idea that has been debated in the educational field. Whether we should include students with special needs in general education classrooms is certainly a controversial issue because, at its source, it is a debate of whether separate can be equal. Today, I want to discuss why inclusive education is not only the best case scenario, but, albeit on a smaller scale, it has already been successful at some schools. I will make the case in this video that inclusive education achieves educational equity. To accomplish this, we will first discuss the prompt that I chose for this final project. Then, we will define educational equity and examine why inclusive education accomplishes educational equity to a great extent. Then, we will evaluate why Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, has tremendous potential to achieve educational equity in this country through its practical use of the idea of inclusive education. To begin this video, let us ask whether separate can be equal. Well, according to Kaufman, Bance, and McCullough, 2002, our contention is that some children's differences require distinctive and therefore separate places for instruction if their educational needs are to be met, and, consequently, that separate placements can be superior to inclusive placements for these children. While the Kaufman article argues for more separate placements for children with disabilities, because separate placements are where those children's needs can be met according to the Kaufman article, I would argue that the place where children with disabilities would succeed the most is in an inclusive classroom where all students are placed regardless of he or she has a disability. This point of view is one of inclusion. An idea intimately connected with inclusion is equity. Basically, if we were making an effort to include all students, wouldn't it be equitable? Here is a more concrete definition of educational equity, and the one we will use for this lecture. Educational equity, according to Henderon 2004, is defined as a check on the justice of specific actions carried out within the educational arena and the arrangements that result from those actions. What does that mean? For the purposes of this assignment, educational equity determines whether all students are placed in environments where they are best positioned to succeed. That would be educational equity done well. Educational inequity, then, would mean that those students are not positioned in a place to succeed as a result of educational policy. Now, we will define inclusive education since that has not been done yet. According to Florian 2008, it is, in essence, the notion that all schools should provide for all students, despite any differences they have, including in how they learn, how they speak, how they look, and others. Inclusive education is also a way for students to be on as level a playing field as possible. Inclusive education is certainly an example of educational equity because it creates the same basic opportunity for academic success for all students. Since all students are in the same classroom, it can be argued that inclusive education is a tangible method for achieving educational equity. Now that we have discussed what inclusive education is, we can examine what makes inclusive education good, and then what makes it not so good. The first benefit of inclusive education we will discuss is that it mitigates the stigmatization surrounding disability. In fact, some may argue that disability itself is a societal construct. According to Baglieri et al. 2011, a preferred style or way of learning only becomes a learning disability, for example, in light of the impatience and structure of an institution that presents things in a limited number of ways with rigid expectations for what counts as timely performance. Thus, disability is only a function of expectations for students relative to peers rather than innate knowledge. Secondly, inclusive education complicates the narratives that special education has established in society. As I said before, special education is a societal construct that perpetuates difference amongst students. These practices often further marginalize students from minority backgrounds, including African Americans and Latinos, through either overrepresentation or underrepresentation in certain disability categories. Rather than seek to exclude and marginalize more students through different measures, inclusive education seeks to bring together all students of all abilities in a melting pot of diverse students. Now we will investigate why inclusive education may not be so good. Here we will examine two critiques. One of these critiques, described by Wade, Toller, and Thorius 2012, is that opponents of inclusive education claim that students with disabilities are being placed into unwelcoming, unprepared general education settings. However, I would argue that students with emotional behavioral disorders, or EBD, who are in close proximity to peers that also exhibit deviant behavior, will often become encouraged by and engage more in said deviant behavior. This is one of the critiques that even the Kaufman article stated could be a limitation of separated classes. The second critique we will discuss is that inclusive education can potentially limit the quality of instruction for children with disabilities, specifically those with emotional and behavioral disorders. One of the staples of the Kaufman article is that general education is not enough for students with behavioral issues. However, the special classroom from this study could be replicated in an inclusive classroom. Many of the interventions discussed in this article, such as behavioral plans, can be replicated in a general education classroom with similar efficacy. Although both of these critiques and others are valid, there are significant advantages to implementing inclusive education practices. It gives all students the same opportunity to demonstrate their knowledge in their own way, rather than in a prescribed manner as it is today. Next, I would like to discuss why inclusive education has not been so widely implemented already. First of all, there is a growing narrative that things are working okay now. You know what they say, if it's not broke, don't fix it? Well, they may be used to rationalize keeping the status quo. According to federal data as well as Saylor and McCart 2014, more students under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, now spend at least 80% of their time in the general education classroom. However, Saylor and McCart argue that these data are skewed. There is a larger amount of students who do not need intensive supports in the classroom. Thus, these students are placed primarily in general education classrooms, but these are not the students who need intensive interventions the most. Rather, in today's climate, the learning gap between students who do not have disabilities and those who do is growing because the students who need supports are inevitably being left behind, despite data indicating that now, more than ever, students are being placed in general education classrooms. Not only does this mean that there are educational inequities today, it also means that we can do something about it. Universal design for learning, which we will discuss next, can be used as an effective solution to this increasingly growing gap between students who do not have disabilities and those who do. Thus, it is a realistic approach to achieving educational equity in schools today. What is Universal Design for Learning, or UDL? According to the Center for Applied Special Technology 2010, the organization that designed UDL in the first place, the purpose of UDL is such that there are as few obstacles to learning as possible. This includes all students, not just students with disabilities. Thus, it is quite appealing as a comprehensive model for any teacher to use to create meaningful lessons and inspire lifelong learning. UDL tailors to all students' needs by making it universal, meaning that any students can access the material, and also utilizes the broad diversity of student learning to maximize the opportunities for students to succeed. Further, the curriculum is designed with all learning needs in mind. In this sense, UDL allows students to access the material in different ways, then show their knowledge of the material in different ways, and offer options that engage students in the manner that is most effective for them. Finally, UDL forces teachers to think outside the box in order to develop effective and meaningful lesson plans to foster real learning instead of rote memorization for tests. Through the lens of educational equity, students are being given supports necessary to succeed using their own way of thinking. Educational equity was defined as a check on whether policy led to the most student success. UDL would allow all students to access the curriculum through unique methods of instruction. How did UDL come to fruition in the first place? According to Hitchcock et al. 2002, the principles of UDL came from architecture, specifically universal design. This meant that buildings became accessible and the blueprints for buildings themselves incorporated the idea of being able to serve anyone who enters the building. Thus, universal design would achieve equity for the individuals that could not access those buildings previously. To transition this to our discussion of UDL, according to the paper previously referenced, authored by Hitchcock et al., building a curriculum with inherent flexibility helps teachers maintain educational integrity and maximize consistency of instructional goals and methods, while still individualizing learning. Teachers now have the flexibility to develop their curriculum depending on their specific students' needs. While many instructional methods come from a one-size-fits-all approach, UDL affords teachers the opportunity to mold the instruction to their students, not the other way around. This ultimately allows teachers to teach their students in the most effective manner possible and move closer towards achieving educational equity. According to McGuire 2014, UDL was developed using the principles of the neuroscience of learning, as well as taking elements of Vygotsky's work. Vygotsky was a psychologist who claimed that we had three neural networks that were critical to learning: a recognition network, a strategic network, and an affective network. These are the essential ingredients to learning according to Vygotsky. In UDL, then, there is no emphasis on providing a wide array of materials that eliminate as many barriers to learning as possible for all students. Secondly, UDL incorporates concepts from the neuroscience of learning. Different areas of the brain associated with learning, such as executive function and memory, can provide important insight as to how differences in brain function affect learning, and then, perhaps most importantly, design curriculum with these differences in mind. However, one misconception about the brain is that there are specific locations for certain brain activities. Brain functions are often ubiquitous, with a multitude of neural networks combining forces to create actions, like me speaking right now. According to Howard Jones, 2014, complexities observed in the brain make it very difficult to draw conclusions that providing instruction in one modality will lead to the best outcomes. Yet, there is research to indicate that presenting information in multiple modalities could enhance instruction. Combined with Vygotsky's 3 neural networks, UDL makes a strong case that presenting content in multiple modalities could lead to success in learning for all students. UDL also accomplishes educational equity because it provides opportunities for students to demonstrate their knowledge in multiple modalities. Going back to the research articulated by Howard Jones, each person's brain processes information differently. Educational equity stipulates that all students be given opportunities to succeed on a policy level, and UDL seems to accomplish that. I adapted the chart on the screen from an IRIS module on UDL from Vanderbilt University. This chart describes how traditional materials can be transformed using UDL into effective vehicles for instruction. Let's look at the first row, a textbook chapter. For the textbook chapter, a UDL solution would be to provide this option for students to access the content through digital text. This would allow the student to manipulate the text on the screen or convert the text to speech. Thus, instead of making the students access the information in a one-dimensional format, teachers using UDL afford the students the ability to access content in a multitude of ways. As seen with the development of UDL as well as this chart, the advent of educational technology has assisted teachers in creating unique, innovative solutions that have the tremendous potential to mitigate barriers to learning for all students and move closer to educational equity. Although UDL is not going to eliminate every single barrier to learning in one attempt, it is designed so that instruction improves over time and allows teachers to modify their instructional delivery with all students' learning needs in mind. While UDL is, of course, not a perfect model for educators to use, it is a blueprint from which to move closer to educational equity for all students. Moving forward, implementing UDL could help mitigate many of the educational issues seen in America today. So let us review what we've accomplished in the video lecture today. First, we discussed the Kaufman quote and how it called for separate classes over inclusion. Then we examined the idea of educational equity and how our society currently has not achieved it, and also the idea of inclusive education, which, although controversial in the educational field today, holds the key for unlocking the virtues of educational equity. Then we discussed how UDL would achieve educational equity in America today through a practical use of inclusive education. Overall, I hope you all learned a substantive amount about the direction I believe education in general should go in the future. I thank you very much for listening to this video lecture. I hope you found it interesting. I would also like to thank Dr. Federico Way-Toller for teaching this course of SPED 461. There is also a full list of references I used for this project on the following slides.